Welcome back. And as you may remember, we were talking about political parties and political machines last time. And now we're going to move on to answer this question of what is responsibility when we're talking about political parties. And so we have our objective, right, to define and understand this idea of responsibility when it comes to political parties. We're going to be talking about essays number 33 and 34. And primarily 34. So again, as a reminder, our definition of a party are activists who organize to win elections in order to run the government and determine public policy. Now, again, these two authors, the American Political Science Association, essay number 33, and Morris Fiorina, essay number 34, are looking at this in the inverse of our definition, right? Because, and this gives you the example that they are not understanding or they're not looking at it from a party's point of view. The American Association of Political Scientists is looking at it from a political science point of view or a theoretical point of view. And essay number 34 is looking at this idea from a public policy, or what gives a healthy debate in public policy. So again, we are at a point where we're talking about practicality of concepts and theoretical concepts. So again, with our definition, activists who organize to win elections in order to run the government and determine public policy. So, responsibility has two meanings in our context today. Responsibility has one meaning to the voter who is responsible. So who is on record? And the other meaning is responsibility when we're talking about a mature or a political process that is objectively based and fairly equal to everyone to participate, right? So who would be responsible in terms of, right, political ideals of equality under the law, or equality of an application of the law, right, and fairness, meaning people have an equal chance to win an election. The first, an essay by the American Political Science Association, is they're talking more about the latter definition. Now, this was written, essay number 33, was written by the American Political Science Association in 1950. Now, again, I know all of you know history, but bottom line was the American presidency and the American Congress and American local government was dominated by the Democrats, to the point where from 1933 to 1952, the Democrats controlled the presidency, Congress, and numerous state houses, to the point where the Republicans approached General Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952 and asked him to run because they were afraid they would no longer exist as a party, according to several biographers of Eisenhower. So in 1950, after the 1948 dramatic victory by Harry S. Truman, the APSA, the American Political Science Association, has this program, and they're talking about how do you sustain a two-party system. And on page 175, I'm going to go fairly quickly through this essay, but their point of view, again, is the country needed to have a two-party system. On page 175, like I said, they said that a stronger two-party system is needed. One, the need for an effective party system. An effective party system requires, first, that the parties are able to bring forth programs which they commit themselves, and second, the parties possess sufficient internal cohesion to carry out these programs. Such a degree of unity within the parties cannot be brought without party procedures that give a large body of people an opportunity to share in the development of the party program. Well, again, the political scientists are taking our definition and flipping it on its head, aren't they? Their concern is public policy. Now, if you ask a politician about public policy, their first answer is going to be, I can't implement policy if I don't win the election. I can't do anything until I win the election. And again, this is why we have only two political parties in our country. Political scientists aren't really concerned about that, are they? They want to have an effective opposition party. They want to have a system within a party within our system that there's a fundamental and robust debate. Again, number two, the fundamental requirement of accountability is a two-party system in which the opposition party acts as the critic of the party in power, developing, defining, and presenting the policy alternatives which are necessary for a true choice in reaching public decisions. The opposition most conducive to responsible government is an organized party opposition. Well, again, one could argue, or one could ask, today's system, do we have a two-party system when the districts are so gerrymandered, or the only half of the people vote, and there's not a lot of debate about the merits or the public policy issues? The debates, are carried on such a pedantic level that and once these parties get elected, and once we change from Democrats to Republicans or Republicans to Democrats, there's no real change in the public policy. And again, you can use the change from President Bush to President Obama, where you had a majority Democratic control of the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the White House. Did we get what they promised? Did we get a healthcare system that was robust? Did we get a change in the war on terror? Did we get different programs? No. Much of the same. And then when President Trump won, and you had the Republicans control the House of Representatives and the Senate, did you have their program implemented? No. So again, just because you have an opposition party does not necessarily mean that the public policy is going to change. So then on page 176, the APSA defines a responsible party. The need for parties responsible to the public. Parties' responsibility means, and this is a definition here, again on 176, party responsibility means the responsibility of both parties to the general public as enforced in elections. Party responsibility to the public enforced in elections implies that there be more than one party, for the public can hold a party responsible only if it has a choice. As a means of achieving responsibility, the clarification of a party policy also tends to keep public debate on a more realistic level, restraining the inclination of party spokesmen to make unsubstantiated statements and charges. So when you have Democratic senators or Democratic candidates who lose an election and they say, I really didn't lose because of the Electoral College, right? Is that a responsible party? Is that a statement of responsibility? Do you honor the results of the election? Now, the Democrats charged President Trump, or Mr. Trump, with, when he was a candidate, with this, again, challenge of he's not going to respect the enforcement or the discipline of an election. Well, it turns out the opposite's true. We'll see what happens in 2020. We'll see, right? But so far, there has been no evidence of Mr. Trump ignoring election results. There has been evidence, and by statements made by Mrs. Clinton, who claims that she won the election, which we know she did not because the election criteria was the Electoral College, and by several senators who were running for president about eliminating the Electoral College. Now, eliminating the Electoral College or keeping the Electoral College, that is a debate. And that is a debate that maybe we should have. But that's not what the law is currently. It's as if, again, is there a discipline? Do you accept the score of a game? You know, I was a high school athlete. Not really, but I was in high school athletics, and we never lost a game. Every time we lost, my teammates or the parents of my teammates would complain about the referees or the umpires. So we never lost. It was always we got robbed. Well, the same is true in this idea of not changing your campaign techniques, not changing your style to the voters, but basically blaming and calling names of the voters. Is that responsibility? And so the APSA finishes their essay by talking about a constitutional amendment, right? The question of a constitutional amendment. Number one, a cabinet system. Should we change to a system that is more like the British? A responsible cabinet system makes the leaders of the majority collectively accountable for the conduct of the government. 2, strong parties as a condition. To amend the Constitution in order to create a responsible cabinet system is not a practicable way of getting more effective parties. And 3, the adaptation within the Constitution. The parties can do much to adapt the usages of the Constitution for their purposes. So they would disagree with having a constitutional amendment. And again, when you start having amendments on these things, you have a real issue. So the APSA is talking in terms of a more theoretical background when it comes to discussing political party structure, and things change dramatically. Like I said, this was written in 1950, and you saw by 1960, in the advent of television and popular culture, that parties soon were losing control over the candidates. So fast forward to the summer of 1980, and Morris Fiorina writes this Decline of Responsible Government, essay number 34. And now he's taking, again, what does he mean by responsibility? He's looking at responsible or response to the voter. See, in the Congress especially, but the voter, as we've talked about, has a pseudo environment, has a perception, and again, you have inputs, right? And these inputs, if you're a candidate, the output you want is their vote, right? And the vote takes place in the real environment, as we talked about. Okay, so again, a question of war or no war. A simple question like this. When you had in 2008 the campaign against Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. So in the Democratic primary, of course, the vast majority of Democratic primary activists were in this camp, right? No war. However, Mrs. Clinton voted for the war. She voted for the war in Iraq. And the question could be, why did she do that? If she really, as a New York senator, why did she do that? Well, again, her personal experience. When her husband was running for president and got the Democratic nomination, there's a real problem with his candidacy in the traditional sense because, as we talked about previously, he had no foreign policy experience being the governor of Arkansas, and he had very, very little of the traditional requirements or criteria that people were voting for president since World War II. So he needed to have several things. He needed to have, now, this is the Gulf War of George W. Bush, right? But there was another Gulf War of his father, George H. Bush, which we call the Gulf War, right? And so Clinton had a problem. And the problem was, Bill Clinton had a problem. So to pick his VP choice, he needed to have one, a Vietnam or of some type of veteran, and two, the person had to vote for the Gulf War. Now, all the candidates that he was going to choose for vice president, there was only one person who filled this bill, and that was Al Gore. Al Gore's father was a senator from Tennessee, and as a young man, he served in Vietnam. He then ran, he was a journalist for the Marine Corps. He then ran for Congress and the Senate from Tennessee, and he had voted for the Gulf War. Almost every other Democrat had not. And it turned out that the Gulf War was popular. So Bill Clinton picked Al Gore because of this criteria. Now, Mrs. Clinton so Mrs. Clinton is the senator from New York. She knows this history. And again, March 2003, 72% of all Americans supported the invasion of Iraq. We went in, I believe, March 21st. And so what happened is as we went in that war, and as we got in that war, and in that war, and in that war, it became incredibly unpopular. So by the point when George W. Bush ran in 2004, he won, but it was despite the Iraq War, or he won and it was an open debate on the Iraq War, and the Democrats had said it was a fiasco. Mrs. Clinton in 2000, 4 years later, Mrs. Clinton in her famous statement said, yes, I voted for the war, but it was implemented so poorly. Trying to discount her vote, right? As a professor at Orange Coast College, I had people talking to me, and they would be saying, yes, I'm against the war, that's why I'm voting for Hillary Clinton. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense, right? Now, State Senator Barack Obama at the time was very smart because he did not have to vote on this. So Obama had his inputs were, I'm a better judge of character, I'm a better judge of the system, but of course he didn't have to vote. There was no responsibility, there was no response that the voters could compare. So you had the Democratic activists who were deciding whether Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama should be their nominee. On the war question, Obama benefits from that because there is no response, right? There's no criteria that really the voters can compare. And Congress has been very, very, very good at this. Again, we read Article 1, Section 8. We know that questions like immigration, questions like war and peace, questions of taxes, questions of all types of issues that we're dealing with today start with the House of Representatives and start with the Senate. And as of this taping, both the legislative branches, both houses of the legislative branch, have yet to provide a police reform bill or a bill that effectively helps with the relief efforts of COVID-19, because they don't want to be on record. They don't want to have a response in which the voter can compare. So this is the problem, right? This is the real issue. And we'll talk about this in greater detail when we talk about Congress. But I'm bringing this up because we vote on personality now, right? So if you remember, again, in the Making of the President in 1960, you had that famous scene. Pardon me. You have that famous scene of LBJ, of Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy debating before the nomination in the hotel lobby in front of the Massachusetts and Texas delegations. And Johnson was at this point the most powerful Democrat. He also was what everyone thought was going to be the next in line to be president. But Johnson's style, as later Nixon would also learn, is their styles were different and not sensitive to the media that was starting to dominate election politics, which was television. And so what did you see? Again, if you notice, you had Johnson at the podium and saying, right, his mannerisms, and I'm proud to tell you that a civil rights platform and me, and I was there, and blah, 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 and other candidates weren't there, and his gestures are huge, his voice is loud, and it's not conducive to television. It's not conducive to the intimacy of that medium. And Kennedy comes up and says, and this is a turning point in American politics, Kennedy says to Johnson, basically, right, you're right. Since you didn't say anything about me personally, I'm going to assume that you meant the other candidates. And I have always thought that you'd be the superb majority leader, and I never questioned you, right? And he takes, at one point, at one fell swoop, Kennedy basically says to the voter, the voting record of the candidates do not matter. What the candidates have done in Congress do not matter. What matters is the funny line, the personality, how I look to you on television. That's what matters. What matters is I was out in the primaries. I was shaking hands in Wisconsin. I was kissing babies in West Virginia. That's what counts. And politicians learn that. And Johnson learned that. And so this is where we are. One of the reasons I asked you to watch that video is because that captures that precise moment where a candidate's record was no longer important. But in other words, that meant that the candidates were no longer responsible in the terms of responding to the voter. There was no longer any type of objective criteria you could use. If you were a voter and you wanted to really decide between candidate A and candidate B, and you looked at their record, you couldn't really decide because Congress doesn't vote on anything. So how do you know? You can only judge by their language, and we know that their language, according to Orwell, is wrapped in insincerity. And so that's why we have sort of this dynamic that we're seeing, where people don't trust the politicians, people don't trust what the program that they tend to run on is, because when implementing that program, it's like gossamer. It just disappears after the election. And that's what Fiorina is saying about responsible government. That's how he defines responsible government. Again, the author's on page 180. The author laments the decline of responsible government, arguing that strong parties offer the best or only way for voters to participate meaningfully in the governing process. So what does our author, what's his premise? His premise is that we have to go back to this idea of voting for the party. And we have to go back to this idea of voting for a party program and not what the individuals are. Well, you can see the first problem with this is that it will not foster revolutionary change. It will not foster any change much at all, right? So he starts, though the founding fathers believed in the necessity of establishing a genuinely national government, they took great pains to design one that could not lightly do things to its citizens. What government might do for its citizens was limited to the functions of what we know now as the watchman state. Thus, the founders composed the constitutional litany familiar to every school child. They created a federal system, they distributed and blended powers within and across the federal levels, and they encouraged the occupants of the various positions checks and balances each other by structuring incentives so that one office holder's ambitions would be likely to conflict with the others. The resulting system of institutional arrangements predictably hampers efforts to undertake major initiatives and favors maintenance of the status quo. So again, we have this condition that has separation of powers. That means that if there is a true national emergency, the politicians are forced to work together. Now, we have a situation, like I said, that politics is overtaking this sense of urgency, and neither party is cooperating, or at least the individuals who are representing us in Congress are doing anything. He goes on, and he's talking primarily about the 1970s with oil price shocks and these kind of things, but he's also talking about special interests and this idea of the individual candidate. Resource shortages and international cartels raise the specter of economic ruin, and the simple proliferation of special interests with their intense, paternalistic demands threatens to render us politically incapable of taking actions that might either advance the state of society or prevent foreseeable deterioration in that state. None of this is to suggest that we should forget about the government can do to us. The contemporary concern with the proper scope and methods of government intervention in the social and economic orders is long overdue. But the modern age demands as well that we worry about our ability to make government work for us. The problem is that we are gradually losing that ability, and a principal reason for this loss is a steady erosion of responsibility in American politics. What do I mean by this important quality, responsibility? To say that some person or group is responsible for a state of affairs is to assert that he or she, that they have the ability to take legitimate actions and have a major impact on that state of affairs, right? So he's defining responsibility, and he goes more colloquially or in everyday language, when someone is responsible, we know whom to blame. And again, our politicians in this era, I mean, this is a very interesting essay because 40 years ago, he saw that the question of who to blame or who to give credit to, right? But who is responsible? That politicians are shoving this away from them as fast as possible. Again, in the COVID-19 situation, wearing a mask has become a political issue. It's ridiculous. Wearing a mask, right? Remember I talked about what you have for breakfast? All issues are political issues according to Orwell. So basically, if I wear a mask, that's a political statement of either I'm for or against a certain political candidate. Wow. Maybe I'm just wearing a mask because I don't want to get sick. Right? This is the question that again we have to ask ourselves. People can tell us, right? People can talk about these inputs, but we're the ones who pick and choose these facts individually. We're the ones who respond or don't respond to a certain news story or a certain phenomena. And that we can't determine who's responsible, right? We can't determine this. Again, if you want to, if you right, the same people that were saying the travel ban was a bad idea and racist and et cetera, are the same people today saying that you have to shut down and wear masks and et cetera. Well, what was the difference? Politics, right? Politics was the difference. So, again, the voter has to have and determine what actions they're going to do, right? So there are times where a candidate that you don't like might have done something right, and a candidate that you love has done something wrong. But do you internalize that? Do you act on those things, or do you rationalize? Right? Are we looking at who is responsible? Because no one's perfect, right? Candidates that we love, candidates that we like. Can we be objective in the criteria? Or do they always have to be right? No matter who that person is. Right? Or are we looking, right? Are we looking at a fashion statement? Or we're looking at without any expertise, right? Where are all the people that were against vaccines? Where are all these people? As we try to get a vaccine for COVID-19. And you know, some of these people in the elite, they'll be first in line. So again, we have this situation of what are the facts and how do we differentiate them from opinion? What is science? What is the methodology of science? Right? Who is responsible? Who is supposed to be taking this on? And this is the highlight of this essay. Now, we have this idea of, you hear this in the media, of the deep state. Well, this is what this author is talking about. So, as you may know, political scientists and people who study government, like people who study baseball or basketball or football or arm wrestling or any other kind of thing, we know who the players are. Right? And so everybody, they have a bench and everybody takes a turn and we know who is what and we know if this person wins, then these people will be appointed primarily because of their party affiliation and because of the things that they've done in the past. Now, one of the very interesting things about the 2016 election was that Donald Trump did not know anyone. The president, roughly speaking, the president on their first day has to appoint about 7,000 people. And Trump, not knowing anyone, and on the transition, and I know people that, because my boss at the State Department was on that transition team, and that person told me that the conservatives, the establishment conservatives, the people that the Republicans would normally go to, people like Elliot Cohen at Johns Hopkins University in defense and other strategists, they basically walked out of the place saying, I'm not working with that guy. And so what happened with when President Trump got inaugurated was that he didn't have anybody to fill these things up with, right? And so you had people that were loyal Democrats or loyal to President Obama. They were called holdovers. And so, so you're sitting there and you're in the new administration, but you really aren't in the new administration. And so, again, who's to blame? Who's responsible? Do I blame the person who kept the job? Or do I blame the lack of preparation because you didn't have enough people, you didn't know enough people, you didn't have a list of people to appoint? Right? That's the question in contemporary terms that this author is posing. In the American context, strong parties have traditionally clarified politics in two ways. First, they allow citizens to assess responsibility easily, at least when the government is unified, which it is more often as in earlier eras when the party meant more than it does today. Citizens need only evaluate the social, economic, and international conditions they observe and make a simple decision for or against the change. They do not need to decide whether the energy, inflation, urban defense policies advocated by their congressmen would be superior to those advocated by then President Jimmy Carter, and when any of them would be enacted. The second way in which strong parties clarify American politics follows from the first. When citizens assess responsibility on the party as a whole, party members have personal incentive to see party evaluated favorably. Now again, so is this contemporary climate a battle between Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump, or is it between Republicans and Democrats? Well, like I just said, many of the people who are office holders in the Republican Party do not support President Trump. They just don't. They don't support him. And we saw this, and you saw this in 1968. The Democratic leadership, the new Democratic leadership, was not supporting Lyndon Johnson in his efforts in Vietnam. And so this is the problem. You have no incentive. If I'm an elected official today, I have no, especially if I'm a Republican, I have very little incentive to support Trump. Matter of fact, like I said, as we talked this morning or today, what happens is right now it looks at like the president is in very, very significant trouble of getting reelected. Now, that could be, at the time of this taping, it's at least 140 days away from the election. So that's a lifetime in politics. But again, the Republicans have a real problem. The Democrats also have a problem. Because, again, if you look at 2016, the two candidates that probably the people supported the most were Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Only one of them received the nomination. In 2020, Bernie Sanders, again, was in the strongest position, but he was outmaneuvered by Joe Biden. So Fiorina goes on, the American institutional structure makes this kind of game playing all too easy. In order to overcome it, we must lay credit or blame for national conditions on all those who had any hand in bringing them about. Some form of collective responsibility is essential. And again, one of the contexts or one of the real weaknesses of our political, I don't want to call it debate because it's not a debate, is that no one will take responsibility, right? President Truman had famously on his desk, the buck stops here. Well, I think President Trump has one of these things going on, right? It's never his responsibility. And same with, I'm not blaming just the president. The Congress is the same, as I've noted before. People in our political structure are not interested in solving problems. And when we realize that, when we understand, when the average voter understands that these people are perpetuating the problems so that they stay in office, that'll be a first step to a more responsible government in the context of what we're talking about. Does that necessarily mean a political party? No. What it means, though, is that people have to be aware, right? People have to be educated in our constitutional structure. People have to be educated in our political structure, and people have to give a damn. All three, I'm not so sure about, but we're trying to do our best this summer, aren't we? Okay, so again, what is responsibility? We have not declared a war since World War II. We have over 250 military interventions since that time. If you're an anti-war activist, who do you target if you never have a vote? Oh, it's always the Republicans. Is it? No, it's not. Right? And so this is the problem. This is the issue. If I am a pro-life activist and we've never had a vote, why am I blaming the Democrats and not the Republicans? Same if I'm a pro-choice activist. If I'm an anti-gun activist. All of these special interests, right? The question is that they are embedded in their own party and they never look past that party. Who is responsible? Again, in 2008, the Democrats had all three branches, and in 2016, the Republicans had all three branches of government, as I discussed. What has changed in that time? Nothing. Nothing has changed. And they keep on blaming the other person. I recall one interview with a senator saying they couldn't do anything because their majority was not 2/3. Now, if I was a Republican, or if I was the Democrats did the same thing in 2008. If I was a party supporter, I think I'd leave that party because they had the perfect ingredients to implement the changes that they kept on talking about, that they've been talking about for 40 years, and they didn't do it. And this is what the essay is talking about. Who do you blame? Who is responsible? And so, as the average American basically says, a pox on both your houses, does the center hold? Right? Does the political center hold? So again, this is our discussion when we're talking about political parties, and we're going to be moving on to elections and interest groups in the following episode. Take care.